a goal of developing the People's Liberation Army into a world-class military by the middle of the 21st century, which is not that far away. Achieving this goal is a critical component of the CCP's efforts to establish a Sino-centric world order. In this new world order, other countries would acquiesce to China's priorities and preferences, an arrangement General Secretary Xi refers to euphemistically as a community. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first hearing of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission's 2023 annual report cycle. Before we begin, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the Commission's newest member, Commissioner Reva Price. Commissioner Price has many years of experience working in Congress on China-related issues, and we look forward to her many contributions to our work. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise and for the work you've put into your testimonies. I'd also like to thank the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works for allowing us the use of this hearing room and the Senate recording studio for their assistance in live streaming this event. I also particularly want to express my appreciation for the work of each of our staff members, the Commission staff members. They are essential to this Commission's success, and today in particular I'd like to thank Sierra Janik, Andrew Hartnett, and Jesse Foster for their capable work in putting together this hearing. Today's hearing will examine the range of foreign engagements undertaken by China's military and internal security forces, as well as elements of China's military-industrial complex and the implications of those activities for the United States. The Chinese Communist Party, under General Secretary Xi Jinping, is pursuing a goal of developing the People's Liberation Army into a world-class military by the middle of the 21st century, which is not that far away. Achieving this goal is a critical component of the CCP's efforts to establish a Sino-centric world order. In this new world order, other countries would acquiesce to China's priorities and preferences, an arrangement General Secretary Xi refers to euphemistically as a community of common human destiny. The foreign activities of the PLA and other Chinese security forces contribute to these goals in several ways. By conducting regular bilateral and multilateral dialogues with other countries' security forces, the PLA is building relationships and expanding its presence on the global stage. By participating in exercises and training with other militaries, the PLA practices power projection skills and cultivates an image of China as a responsible contributor to global security. Maintaining robust defense ties with Russia, China has sought to learn from its past combat experience and also continues to pursue joint development of advanced military technology, such as heavy-lift helicopters. The advanced economies of Europe have played a role in supporting the PLA's development by licensing Chinese production of defense articles that China's state-owned defense corporations have subsequently indigenized organized for the PLA's own use and for export. China is also a major player in the international arms market, ranking among the top 5 global arms suppliers since at least 2010. Although its total sales remain significantly below those of the United States or Russia, China has established itself as a leading global provider of certain weapons such as unmanned aerial vehicles. It is also a major supplier to certain countries on its periphery, such as Pakistan and Bangladesh. As in so many other areas of foreign engagement, when it comes to foreign military sales, Chinese companies have no qualms about selling weapons to countries or parties that the U.S. and other countries will not, including the military dictatorship in Burma or in active conflict zones in Sudan and South Sudan. As the U.S. and its allies navigate the strategic competition with China, it is imperative that we understand both the drivers of China's foreign military activities and their implications for the international security order. China's military relationship with Russia deserves particular scrutiny in the continued fallout from Russian President Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. Finally, as Beijing continues to promote the still vague idea of a global security initiative led by China, a thorough examination of China's military diplomacy will provide valuable insight into what the world should expect in years to come. We look forward to exploring these topics in details in the hearing today and to discussing actionable policy recommendations for the U.S. Congress. I will now turn the floor over to my colleague and co-chair for this hearing, Commissioner Randy Shriver.
Thank you. Good morning. I join Commissioner Bartholomew, Chair Bartholomew, in welcoming our witnesses and to those watching online. The ongoing of the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, will be instrumental in determining whether or not General Xi Jinping's aspirations for great national rejuvenization are met. The goals behind General Secretary Xi's direction for the PLA to become a world-class military by 2049 are not limited to symbolism or a simple desire to acquire the trappings of global power status. In fact, for the CCP to succeed and meet its own ambitions, the PLA must become a much more capable military. General Secretary Xi needs a PLA capable of protecting PRC sovereignty to include securing effective control over a number of expansive and illegal sovereignty claims. He needs a PLA that can successfully operationalize a Taiwan contingency for the purpose of forced unification. He needs a PLA that can look after broader regional and even global interests, particularly where protection of sea lines of communication are concerned. And he needs a PLA that can be successful in augmenting PRC diplomatic and economic efforts to create a regional order where countries are more deferential to its preferences and interests. It is increasingly clear that the CCP believes that the PLA must be more active abroad in order to acquire the necessary capabilities and to be better postured to play this role and vision for it. Under the guidance of the CCP and the Central Military Commission, the PLA is engaging in military diplomacy of various kinds, is conducting bilateral and multilateral exercises with greater frequency, is creating foreign bases and access opportunities, is engaging in operational military activities with foreign partners, and is active in promoting foreign military sales. This external agenda is very robust. As these activities expand and evolve, we want to know more about how these activities impact Chinese military modernization, how they promote relationships for China that may alter the geopolitical landscape, and how they impact our allies and partners, and most importantly, how they affect U.S.-China great power competition. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and learning from our witnesses on all these matters. Our first panel will examine the concepts and strategy of China's military diplomacy and overseas security diplomacy. We'll start with Dr. Philip Saunders. Dr. Saunders is director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. His testimony will provide an overview of China's military diplomacy. Next, we'll hear from Kristen Gunness, a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Ms. Gunness will address China's diplomacy through security dialogues and educational exchanges. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Jordan Link, an independent researcher and former China policy analyst for national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress. He will discuss the Chinese Ministry of Public Security's engagement with other countries' internal security forces. Thank you all very much for your testimony. The Commission is looking forward to your remarks. and I ask our witnesses to please keep their remarks to 7 minutes. Dr. Saunders, we begin with you.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here today to participate in this hearing. My testimony today is going to draw heavily on a database that the National Defense University set up on Chinese military diplomacy. It's based on pioneering work by Ken Allen, but updated by a string of talented research assistants and research interns, including Ms. Melodie, who you'll hear from later today. And I'm going to try to give an overview of the objectives and paint the big picture of what China does. The PLA defines military diplomacy as external relations pertaining to military and related affairs between countries and groups of countries, including things like military personnel exchanges, negotiations, arms control negotiations, military aid, military intelligence cooperation, military technology cooperation, peacekeeping, military alliance activities, etc. And I think the key point is they conceive of this as a component of China's broader diplomatic efforts, and they stress that military diplomacy must always serve the overall foreign policy of China. I think this is the case. If you look at the big outlines of Chinese foreign policy, the focus is on strategic relations with great powers, countries on the periphery, and engaging the developing world. Those are exactly the priorities for military diplomacy. A couple key points. Best thought of as a means of strengthening bilateral relationships, not as an end in itself. A lot of the activity really isn't very substantive, but it's important in political and relationship terms. And one of the things that it's useful for as an indicator of the overall state of bilateral relations. If things are going good, the military activity will pick up. If there's problems in the relationship, it will slow down. To talk briefly about a couple of the goals, I think it can be divided into strategic and operational goals. Strategic goals including supporting Chinese diplomacy and foreign policy, shaping the security environment. Operational goals include collecting intelligence and learning new skills to support PLA modernization. And the types of things the PLA does include senior level visits, security dialogues, military exercises, both bilateral and multilateral, naval port calls, functional exchanges focused on specific military areas, and also non-traditional security operations, including humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and peacekeeping. If we look at it in the big picture, the bulk of what the PLA does in this realm is high-level meetings. It's senior PLA officers meeting with foreign counterparts. But we do see, starting in about 2009, military exercises and port calls starting to make up a bigger percentage of that activity. And I think I've given you a handout, figure 1, that talks about this a little bit. The numbers in our database show that this peaked in about 2015 and has declined somewhat since. We attribute that to PLA internal reforms, which have had an internal focus. One interesting thing that comes out in the data is it tracks with the 5-year political cycle. When it's a party Congress year, the PLA senior officers are busy politicking at home in Beijing. They have less time to go abroad and meet with foreigners. And then finally, the big impact of COVID-19, the diplomatic engagements just fall off the roof in 2020 and 21. I was asked to speak about priorities. Asia is the highest priority region. Europe is second, and Africa a distant third. And within Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia are the main sub-regions. I want to just note that this is a global presence. The PLA has more than 130 military attaché or military representative offices abroad. They're regularly engaged in UN peacekeeping operations, usually about 5 at any given time with about 2,500 troops. They participate periodically in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and they've maintained an escort task force, a counter-piracy force in the Gulf of Aden since December 2008. And that all provides access to foreign militaries. I was asked to talk a little bit about the changes. Again, this decline since 2015, I think that's a lot to do with tighter CCP control of the military and a PLA that's focused on reforms. One of the things that stands out is an increased comfort with multilateral settings. PLA used to be very suspicious of this, but it now participates in multilateral meetings organized by ASEAN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS grouping, the Shangri-La Dialogue, and China has started to host its own groupings such as the Shangshan Forum, the China-Africa Peace and Security Forum, and the China-Latin America Defense Forum. I mentioned the impact of COVID, which was significant. I won't go into detail on the organizations responsible for this, but the key one is the Central Military Commission's Office of International Military Cooperation. The Defense Minister plays a crucial role. He supervises that office. He also sits on the CCP's Central Foreign Affairs Committee, and he is the liaison with the rest of the Chinese government. Because as Commissioner Shriver said, the PLA is a party army. They don't really work for the government. So you need mechanisms like that. The CMC Joint Staff Department, the Chief of General Staff, plays a role in military diplomacy, and they have a deputy who is in charge of intelligence and foreign affairs who's actively also involved. To get to the implications very concisely, this is a new area of U.S.-China strategic competition, most intense in the Indo-Pacific, but also evident in other regions. We're going to see and are seeing the U.S. and China use the tools of military diplomacy to strengthen military ties and increase their influence with third countries. And this is an area just that's going to be part of the competition. They sometimes try to use this to undermine U.S. alliances, I think with not a lot of success. The trend I see is something different. It's U.S. allies and partners that are engaging the PLA as part of their broader, a piece of their broader China strategy. And some are doing this very consciously for symbolic, mostly symbolic political reasons. I personally don't think Washington should get too upset if countries like Australia and Singapore are using symbolic military cooperation with the PLA to offset their much more substantive military competition with us. And so my view is rather than try to stop it, we should focus on limits on it. Limiting the PLA ability to learn from foreign militaries, limiting their ability to learn the things that we teach allies and partners, and trying to restrict their access to ports and bases. And with that, there's more to say, but not more time to say it in, so I'm going to end on time, and I'll save my other points for Q&A.
Great, thank you. Ms. Gunness?
Co-Chair Bartholomew and Co-Chair Shriver, Commission members and staff, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify at this hearing. For my testimony, I'll address the objectives of China's overseas military diplomacy, how China's approach has evolved given intensifying U.S. strategic competition, ways in which China's military diplomacy activities could potentially challenge U.S. interests, and recommendations for policymakers. China appears to have three primary objectives for overseas military diplomacy. First, China uses military diplomacy to help shape the international environment to be more conducive to Chinese interests. It does this by using military diplomacy to promote certain narratives that are aimed at bolstering China's image overseas and shaping the global perception in China's favor. For example, China frequently frames overseas military engagements as promoting its peaceful rise through supporting international security and contributing to stability. China also uses military diplomacy as a tool to counter anti-China narratives and promote its own vision of global security. For example, the PLA focuses military diplomacy efforts in developing countries that participate in the Belt and Road Initiative to cultivate relations with partners that are willing to join it in pushing back against what it frames as a Western-led system unfair to developing nations. Second, as the U.S.-China competition intensifies, military diplomacy is one of the tools that China is using to gain advantage. The PLA's foreign engagements now play a supporting role in China's broader efforts to build a network of partners that prioritize relations with China over the United States, degrade U.S. influence and partnerships, as well as promote its own agenda. This has resulted in China increasing its security footprint in the Pacific Island states, Latin America, and Africa. Military diplomacy also serves to help China increase its military access near vital economic and strategic interests. Examples include peacekeeping operations in unstable but energy-rich countries in Africa and security partnership building with countries in Central and South Asia. These activities, if successful, could potentially extend the range and geographic reach of China's military capabilities in the future, as well as institutionalize and normalize Chinese military access overseas. A third objective is that military diplomacy supports the PLA's development of expeditionary capabilities, an ability to conduct overseas missions through expanding security partnerships and opportunities to build operational experience by deploying abroad. The PLA's counter-piracy missions are an example of the military using non-traditional security operations to develop a specific capability, in this case, sea lines of communication or SLOC protection, and facilitate ties with countries in Africa and the Middle East, eventually leading to the establishment of China's naval base in Djibouti. Military diplomacy could also potentially aid China in gaining access to military or dual-use technology, including through military exchanges and collaboration with European militaries and research institutes, for example, and the PLA's overseas military engagements have facilitated countries like Pakistan in gaining access to technologies to improve their military capabilities. The PLA has confronted several challenges in using military diplomacy to support its foreign policy goals, however, including limited access and improved overseas relations and access, small deployments in developing countries that are difficult to expand without significant additional investment, lack of PLA readiness to take on increased security missions in unstable countries, and the political nature of China's military engagements that provide limited benefits for foreign militaries. And finally, that the PLA's military diplomacy is really beholden to China's overall approach to its foreign policy, which is not always conducive to expanding military relations abroad. However, Chinese military diplomacy activities do have the potential to challenge U.S. interests through more opportunities for intelligence collection against U.S. allies and partners, the potential establishment of additional overseas bases, which could provide a platform for extended PLA operational reach, and efforts through arms sales, technology transfer, and military training to build a wider range of partners with more military capability that could impact U.S. interests. Given China's approach to overseas military diplomacy and the potential challenges to U.S. interests, U.S. policymakers might consider the following. First, capitalize on the United States' robust alliance and partnership network to limit China's access. China is still building a network of security partners focused on gaining access to economically vital and strategic locations. The United States should capitalize on its extensive network of allies and partners to advance security cooperation with key countries to limit their willingness to allow China to access ports and other infrastructure. This could include more security cooperation with states in the Pacific Islands, South Asia, and the Indian Ocean region. Second, work with U.S. allies and partners to mitigate intelligence risks from Chinese military diplomacy activities. The United States could assist allies and partners in mitigating intelligence collection risks by leading efforts to bolster counterintelligence and information security capabilities, as well as support allies and partners in gaining a comprehensive picture of Chinese military activities in their region. Third, increase awareness on China's overseas military diplomacy, how it supports broader Chinese foreign policy objectives, and the implications for U.S. ally and partner interests. For example, the United States could consider conducting frank discussions with its allies and partners about limiting the opportunities for the PLA to use military diplomacy, including professional military education exchanges, to increase operational capabilities and technical knowledge. Fourth, elevate the public profile of U.S. military engagements. The United States could ensure that its own engagements are visible to allies and partners, as well as to China, and that the benefits of those engagements are clearly articulated. And fifth, consider supporting additional research on China's military diplomacy. Topics could include examining how military diplomacy efforts to expand security relationships are tied to broader Chinese initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and assessing future trends and assumptions for how the PLA might employ military diplomacy in the context of U.S.-China competition. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Link.
Distinguished co-chairs and commissioners, thank you for allowing me to testify today on the overseas security activities of China's Ministry of Public Security. Under President Xi Jinping, the CCP has significantly expanded the overseas activities of the MPS, increasingly using security cooperation as a tool to expand its influence and shape global security norms. The MPS is typically understood as a domestic-facing institution. Its day-to-day responsibilities include law enforcement and criminal justice work. The institution's priorities also include authoritarian political policing, such as stability maintenance, a euphemism for controlling protests, riots, and other forms of dissent. The MPS is a core part of the CCP's coercive apparatus, serving as one of the party's main tools to maintain political power and social order. The MPS also has an international mandate to organize exchanges and collaborate with international police and security apparatuses. The scope of the MPS's international activities can be divided into three main categories. Number one, unilateral actions, including transnational repression and illegal rendition campaigns. Number two, bilateral engagements, including bilateral meetings, formal agreements, capacity building activities, material assistance, and extraterritorial joint security patrols. And three, multilateral engagement, including the creation of new international institutions and activities within established bodies such as Interpol. The MPS's global efforts pose significant challenges to the United States and other liberal democracies, such as the MPS conducts transnational repression operations such as kidnapping and threatening individuals abroad. It operates under the CCP's own definition of the rule of law and terrorism, which depart from globally established norms, simultaneously eroding the shared recognition of these concepts while creating the pretext for a wide-ranging authority to act abroad. And finally, MPS norm-breaking behaviors may also encourage other authoritarian regimes to act in similar ways. In terms of unilateral actions, the MPS plays a key role in the CCP's ongoing global campaign of transnational repression, most notably through rendition campaigns called Operation Fox Hunt and Operation Skynet. Operation Fox Hunt was launched in 2014 and is an initiative to locate and extradite alleged Chinese fugitives who have fled overseas. President Xi and the CCP have also used these campaigns to purge political rivals, silence critics, and eliminate perceived foreign intelligence risks. Substantial evidence confirms that Operation Fox Hunt missions have been conducted on U.S. soil, where agents have surveilled, harassed, and coerced U.S. citizens. In terms of bilateral and multilateral engagement, MPS interactions with foreign counterparts serve to forge stronger relationships with peer security institutions, building the MPS's reputation as a credible security partner. Of 114 identified bilateral exchanges, over half of which have occurred under President Xi's tenure. Over 60% of these took place with Asian governments, about half of whom border China. Counterterrorism was the most frequently discussed topic in identified bilateral exchanges, aligning with the MPS's role as the PRC's leading organization on counterterrorism matters. Other commonly discussed topics during these meetings include transnational crime, counter-drug efforts, law enforcement cooperation and capacity building, and border security. Topics such as maintaining stability and managing protests and riots were mentioned in at least 41 different bilateral meetings with officials from 18 different countries. The MPS assigned at least 51 agreements with 31 different partner governments between 1995 and 2020. These agreements have the potential for negative downstream effects related to human rights. For example, in June 2017, the Egyptian government announced the signing of a cooperation agreement between the MPS and Egypt's Ministry of Interior to address the spread of terrorism and extremist ideology. Weeks later, Egypt detained more than 200 Uyghurs residing in Egypt, a step some suspect came in response to a call from Beijing. The MPS also provides capacity building opportunities such as training sessions to partner security institutions across the globe. Of the 77 sessions identified, Asian governments received the most training sessions at about 40%. African governments received the next largest share at 35%. The MPS has trained police from 10 different countries on stability maintenance topics. Increasingly, the MPS has offered training on cyber and technology topics, including electronic data forensics, network attack and defense technology, and artificial intelligence. From 2006 to 2021, the MPS provided material assistance to 22 different countries on 39 different occasions. These donations range from computers, police equipment, and investigative technologies to the construction of facilities for partner security institutions and the provision of COVID-19 related PPE. The MPS has also conducted bilateral joint patrols with police officers in Croatia, Italy, and Serbia between 2016 and 2019. According to Chinese news sources, these patrols are intended to protect Chinese tourists and overseas Chinese citizens during the height of tourist season. In terms of the MPS's multilateral engagement, in 2015, the MPS created an international institution to forge stronger relationships abroad called the Lianrengang Forum. This forum convenes police and security sector officials from 30 to 40 countries annually, most recently in 2020. Participants in this forum range from liberal democracies to authoritarian regimes. The MPS has hosted a police equipment expo alongside this forum to offer business opportunities to domestic security firms, featuring products like video surveillance, image processing, drones, facial recognition systems, smart transport and smart city technologies, armored vehicles, and weapons. The MPS also engages within existing multilateral institutions such as Interpol. While Interpol is forbidden under Article 3 of its Constitution from undertaking any intervention or activities of a political, military, religious, or racial character, Beijing and the MPS have reportedly violated Interpol's rules by pursuing political dissidents via the Red Notice system, subverting the true criminal investigative purposes of the institution. Moving to policy recommendations, the core objective to addressing the MPS's increasing malign role in China's foreign policy toolkit should be to counter and deter the MPS's willingness and ability to conduct activities abroad that break local and international law, undermine international norms on security sector governance, and endanger civilians. At the same time, the U.S. must address the fact that in certain circumstances, the MPS is meeting public security demands from countries that share the PRC's authoritarian values. To protect the U.S.'s interests, the U.S. Congress should counter transnational repression occurring in the U.S. by crafting new legislation to deter such activities while focusing on helping individuals that are targeted by the institution. And then second, building a knowledge base of MPS activity through increased monitoring of and reporting on the MPS, sharing that information with other governments, and pressing for increased transparency of partner governments' engagement with the MPS. A first step should include mandating a regular congressional report on the MPS's activities. Thank you.
Thank you. 3 excellent statements, very rich. For fellow commissioners, we are going to go in reverse alphabetical order. And the chair and co-chair will reserve our questions to the end. We're going to make this really complicated. But we'll start, in that case, with Vice Chairman Wong.
Thank you. Well, thanks for your testimonies and your written submissions. I'll start with, is it Dr. Gunness or Professor? Okay, Ms. Gunness. I noticed at the end of your written testimony, you mentioned in further areas of study or for development, you mentioned the Global Security Initiative. Now that concept that Xi Jinping put out, I mean, at least to me, is very amorphous. I'm not really quite sure what it means. And could you or maybe talk a little bit of how you see military diplomacy fitting into that concept, I mean, even if preliminarily, given that it is an amorphous concept?
Sure. Thanks for your question. So I think the Global Security Initiative, notwithstanding, I think the main point is that China is increasingly using the military as a tool to support its broader security and foreign policy goals. And part of that is because the PLA actually has the capabilities to be able to do that now, whereas they didn't in the past. But the other part of it is I think that is the intent of military diplomacy, and that's to, as I was saying in my testimony, to gain access, to build relations, to build a network of partners that will feed into China's economic goals and foreign policy goals. So I think, the Global Security Initiative is kind of amorphous. It's hard, maybe Dr. Saunders can explain it better, but I think at this point there aren't a lot of details right now in the public domain anyway about it. But the broader point is that the military diplomacy will continue to feed into that and support some of those broader foreign policy goals.
Anything to add, Mr. Saunders?
Not a lot specifically, but just to note that this is a pattern that you see sometimes in China. The leadership will endorse an amorphous concept. Everybody in the bureaucracy tries to figure out, how can we shape this? How can we put our stuff inside it? And I think the PLA is one of the actors trying to do that, okay, we have all these capabilities, we have all these things we want to do. How do we peg it to a concept like Global Security Initiative that Xi Jinping has endorsed? And then we get more resources and bureaucratic credit for doing so. So I don't have a lot to say specifically because I think it's still very much a work in progress.
So we don't quite know, and perhaps they don't quite know how it all fits. Second, reading some of your recommendations from all of you, you talk about limiting the negative effects on U.S. interests from expanded cooperation, expanded exercises, weapon sales, training. It strikes me, and tell me if this is wrong, that, look, in the long term, as China expands its presence and basing and relationships across the world, yes, there is this threat of Chinese power projection. I don't think they have the capabilities or the strength of relationships yet to do that globally. But in the short term, it sounds like from your recommendations, the main concern for the U.S. is that it will complicate our alliance relationships, either in compromising or from an intelligence perspective, our training methods, our doctrines, our technology, or perhaps the fact that the Chinese have even a small foothold in some of these partner nations, that will then make them more reluctant to give us the access, the operational maneuverability, whatever terms you want to use, in those areas. Is that correct? So short term, it complicates our alliance structure. Long term is power projection from the Chinese?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, I mean, if you take something like the Pacific Islands, for example, where China has worked on building influence in a variety of areas. It's not just security cooperation, but also economically. They've worked on building influence. That's an area where the U.S. has not, until recently, focused a lot of our security engagement, as well as foreign policy efforts on that area. So I think that is, they look for areas like that where they can sort of gain advantage, where the U.S. maybe isn't paying as much attention, but also where there are strategic locations that they might be able to take advantage of. And so I think it's sort of a two-part thing.
I would say with U.S. allies and partners, we typically have a very good security relationship, a very robust one, and if they compare what they are getting from China and what they're getting from us, what the dialogue with China is, what the dialogue with us, it's entirely different. It's much more substantive in the relations with the U.S. And so for our allies and partners, if they're doing things with China, it's usually because they want to learn about China or they want to manage their relationship with China. And the help they need is to kind of raise the game, know how the PLA operates, know how to protect yourself, know how to protect the things we taught you. For developing countries, they're looking for any kind of training and assistance they can get from all comers. So it's a very different dynamic there.
Thank you.
Commissioner Price, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating today. And your testimony has been very, very helpful. First question, and I think to Ms. Gunness and Mr. Saunders, following up on what Commissioner Wong just asked, how, in your opinion, should U.S. policymakers weigh the costs and benefits of engagement with China's security forces?
One part of it is to do no harm. So we want to be careful what we do, what we talk to them about, what we show them. And I think generally in my experience, I've been with the Department of Defense, personal views, but since 2004, I have seen a pretty careful effort to vet what we do and to exercise positive control over it. So that's one piece. But second is to think, what's the positive agenda? I mean, we are in a competitive relationship with China. It would be good to have better crisis management and crisis communications mechanisms to deal with the problems that come up. It would be better to have an understanding of how the PLA thinks, how they're thinking about the world, what are their threat perceptions. These engagements provide a window on that, and you have to be disciplined, you have to be prepared, but if you know the right questions to ask and ask in a disciplined way, you can learn a lot from engaging the PLA. Part of our job is to do research on that. We've done a number of books, including on the PLA's reforms, and I can say that our ability to meet with them, to talk with them, to understand why they're doing what they're doing, offered a lot of really, really valuable insights. So part of it is being, very disciplined and very focused, very prepared for your engagements, know what you want to learn, know what you want to ask, know what you want to protect, and do so in a really disciplined way. So I think that kind of preparation, some things we just know we don't want to talk to them, we don't want to help them modernize their military, improve their joint operations capabilities. And just an anecdote, I talked to a senior PLA general who was directly involved in doing this, and he said, we would like to do exercises with you on traditional security things. We want to learn from you, but you won't do it with us, so we have no choice but to go to the Russians. We really want to learn from you, but you're not going to let us do that. So.
I would just add that I agree with everything Dr. Saunders said. But I would just add that there's the political aspect of these interactions is important too, especially for countries in the region that want to be seen as bolstering relations with China in certain ways. They are part and parcel of other engagements that countries in the region have with China. So I think not necessarily asking them to curtail those engagements, but more about education about the objectives that China's pursuing, and again about military diplomacy activities that might be harmful to their interests or U.S. interests is the way to.
Thank you. Mr. Link, your presentation, your focus on the Ministry of Public Security's activities, very, very interesting and helpful. Have you observed any recent efforts by the U.S. or our allies to better assess the MPS's overseas presence and potentially respond to their activities with overseas police stations, et cetera? It's very much part of your recommendations, so I don't know where that...
So I guess that we've seen the FBI and other folk, within our own intelligence community, have press conferences and things like that about drawing light to the Operation Fox Hunt and transnational repression and things of that nature. But in terms of the other types of engagements, no, not really. But also, that's not like my specific research focus here. So I might have missed it, but I don't think that I've seen it.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions for now.
Commissioner Mann.
Thank you. I want to ask all the witnesses, but I think I'm going to start with Philip Saunders, a broad question, which is what makes the PLA's military diplomacy different from ours, other than the fairly significant point of the government or regime they represent and the ones they work with and their competition with us? I mean, is there something, draw out for me what makes the nature of their diplomacy different? Philip Saunders testified the types of things the PLA does, and they sounded like, in many cases, like what we do: high-level diplomacy, disaster relief, port calls, and so on. So I ask this open-ended: is there something different, or is it very much like what we do?
Well, so I guess two things. One, partly they're watching what we do and modeled somewhat on what we do. So a lot of the lines of effort are parallel formally, but I think there's a lot of difference in the content. So you have a high-level meeting with a U.S. military officer. You're going to get a pretty frank assessment. You're going to get a statement of U.S. policy. It is the start of a relationship, and we'll try to follow up on build that. That's part of how U.S. senior military officers get to be senior military officers, is by building and maintaining those relationships. If you have a similar meeting with a PLA senior officer, they're going to stick to their talking points. They are not going to be able to follow up offline out of official channels. It's probably a one and done. You're probably not going to engage with them more for their duration. They can only make one trip overseas a year. They're going to give you the party line and the talking points, and they're not going to move from that. Those may well be lies or transparently exaggerated falsehoods. And you come out of the meeting not having built any trust or built a relationship. You've learned what the Chinese talking points are, and at least in my experience with some of these meetings, you come away with a more negative impression than you start with. So that's part that they're under political controls which really inhibit what they do. I think similarly with a lot of training and education, and I'll speak to military education because that's the area I know best. When the PLA brings foreign students in, they have a separate campus. They have a separate program. They will sometimes have Chinese PLA officers there participating in the class. But essentially, it's a stage-managed set of education done specifically for foreigners. When the U.S. brings foreign students into our military education schools, they're essentially getting the same kind of training that the U.S. students are getting. They're in the same classes with them, learning the same curriculum. They come away with a much deeper understanding of the subject and relationships with both their U.S. counterparts and their other foreign counterparts that in many cases last for decades. So it's a very different qualitative experience. So I think a lot of these things are similar in form, but if you look at the content in dialogues and high-level meetings and in educational sessions, they're very much different. And I think the U.S. in general is much more focused on building partner capacity and interoperability than the PLA is.
Yeah, just to piggyback on those comments, I think the breadth of U.S. security engagement and cooperation is quite different from the PLAs. And this is partly a question of capabilities, that they haven't had the capabilities to do some of these things until relatively recently. But I think it's also, to Dr. Saunders' point, a question of different intent. So the political nature of the exchanges really limits benefits to foreign militaries, such as augmenting capabilities and interoperability. There are anecdotes of militaries of certain countries saying, well, yeah, we're happy to have the PLA come and train us or help us with our training, but honestly, they're not. We don't always, think they're all that great compared to other countries' training. So I mean, there are, you can find anecdotes like that. So that I think speaks to the more limited nature of PLA cooperation, and also the political aspect of the cooperation, which is quite different from the U.S. military.
If I could
Thank
add
you.
one quick point. There's a group of foreign students who've been trained by the PLA and been trained by the U.S. And that's an opportunity to talk to them and get their views on, what are the strengths and weaknesses of how the U.S. does it, what are the strengths and weaknesses of how China does it. And many, many people have been through both of those courses.
Okay, thank you. Jim, if you got one question in, if you'd like a second round, I think we'll have time.
Good, okay.
Commissioner Goodwin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my appreciation to the witnesses for your time today. Dr. Saunders and Ms. Gunness, you both reference some of the military diplomatic activity that the PLA engages in the form of counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, and how that obviously is designed to help gain critical expertise in protecting sea lines of communication, but also designed to help protect energy security. My question is, have we seen any trends or an uptick in this sort of engagement and outreach since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, geared specifically towards protecting energy security?
That's a great question. I think the answer is I haven't really seen that. The bigger impact has been COVID, because what used to happen is the PLA would send 2 or 3 ships out to Gulf of Aden for about 4 months. They would refuel from Djibouti, and then on the way back, they would make 4 or 5 port calls and do various engagements with foreign militaries on the way back. And that serves some of the purposes Ms. Gunness talked about in terms of building ties. What's happened in the COVID environment is they made the last of those port calls in March of 2000. Now they finish their deployment and they sail straight home. So they're not doing those kinds of things. Even when they're doing resupply, they're doing it from Djibouti. And I saw the video on this. Essentially, they were loading food in China, shrink wrapping it, putting it on a Costco freighter, sailing it to Djibouti, offloading it in Djibouti directly to the PLA ships. So very little interaction with the host government or not. So I think COVID has really curtailed a lot of that in their ability to do some of these military engagements for the purpose of protecting energy security. They're still getting the operational experience in terms of crews and commanders out there doing operational things, which is part of the benefit from them. But I think COVID's really kind of knocked them off that game.
Yeah, I would just add that some of the non-traditional security operations like peacekeeping also that the PLA has done is sort of, again, meant to support China in building relationships to diversify its energy resources, sources of supply. So while that's not exactly what you're talking about, I do think it is kind of, again, the intent of some of these military diplomacy activities and non-traditional security operations is to really build relations with countries where China can diversify energy supply, because it's something they've been very concerned about for a long time now.
Thank you. Mr. Link had a question about the red notices, which in and of themselves are not arrest warrants, but they're just requests to detain individuals pending extradition based upon an order or a warrant issued in the requesting country. My question is, what is the extent of Interpol's review of these requests, including for compliance with all the requirements, but most notably Article 3 of their own constitution?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. From my research, it sounds like the review process is underfunded within Interpol, that there's just so many requests that go through that they don't have like the proper screening mechanisms or enough people to do the proper screening mechanisms. And so that's why oftentimes they just kind of go through. And that's why we're kind of in the situation that we're in now.
Well, that may answer my next question, which is there any publicly available data on the number of red notices that are requested by country, the extent of the review, whether they're granted or denied or rejected based upon noncompliance?
Yeah, and so that's another issue, that Interpol is kind of non-transparent. And so I think that there's like the total number of red notices. I don't know if it's broken down by year, but I also don't think that it's broken down by country, publicly at least.
In your written testimony, you reference the fact that the NPSs face few consequences for arguably violating the spirit of this red notice and Article 3 with these red notice requests. Are there any formal mechanisms in place in the red notice process for imposing consequences for abuse of that system or filing what I would refer to as frivolous requests?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I don't think so. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Friedberg.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of our witnesses. I'd like to start with Dr. Saunders. You made an observation about U.S.-China military interaction that began to decline in 2015. What was the reason for that? Was this primarily at the PRAC's instigation or at ours?
Melodie Ha will talk to that in more detail in her testimony, but concisely, it's intensified U.S.-China competition. I think a lot of the decline is on the U.S. side, being more careful and disciplined and screening what kind of activities we want to go forward. And then there's the extraneous factor that the PLA reforms kicked in at the end of 2015, and they were very internally focused in all the things they needed to do to put those reforms in place, and just generally had less time for military diplomacy. So part of that deals specifically with the U.S., part of it is a more general phenomenon.
Do we have any insight into how the PLA views the utility of these contacts with the United States?
I think they view them as a useful means of presenting their talking points, of learning what U.S. thinking is and what the United States is up to. As I mentioned, they hope to use this military relationship to support their modernization and improve their combat capability. And I think we've been pretty disciplined in trying to make sure they don't have opportunities to do that. There is a prestige part of it. Dealing directly with the U.S., the most powerful country in the world, makes China look good. And then sometimes they have particular pieces of business that they want to get done. They want to press the U.S. to limit its reconnaissance operations. They want to warn the U.S. against doing things with Taiwan. And at times, they've been willing to pursue specific kinds of cooperation, such as the rules of engagement for air and maritime encounters, when they find that in their interests. In that case, they were told to do it by Xi Jinping, according to several Chinese sources that I've talked to. The directive came down from the top, and partly to use mill-to-mill as a means of managing the relationship with the United States, and specifically to use the confidence-building measures, the rules of engagement, to try to improve relations with the U.S.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Gunness, I'd like to ask you to speculate. I know this isn't quite fair, but with all of the factors that you describe, if you had to guess, looking ahead, say 5 or 10 years, what would you expect the overall shape and intensity of Chinese overseas engagement to look like? What are the next steps, do you think, in this outward projection of PLA power?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it speaks to the broader question of the type of military that China wants to build. And clearly they want to build a military with global projection, power projection of some sort. But to I think how large that will be and what type of military that will be is still an open-ended question. And part of that is because in order to build the kind of military that the United States has, for example, if that's what they would choose to do, they would need a much bigger network of allies and partners. They would need a lot of investment. And the main strategic direction of the military right now is still regional. It's Taiwan and the regional conflicts in the periphery, as Dr. Saunders noted. So I do think, with all that said, I do think that China will continue to expand its overseas military diplomacy with the intent of building relationships along the Belt and Road, to build partnerships with those countries, both for economic interests, but also to gain access. I do think they will probably continue to expand security footprints in some of the areas that they already have a small security footprint in. Those areas might be Latin America, for example, where they have the Strategic Support Force operates as a space station right now. So I think we will see a lot more of that. I think we will see the Navy in particular, doing more port calls, going out and about more. But that said, I do want to also emphasize that the deployments overseas right now for the PLA are pretty limited and small. And so to actually grow those would require, again, a lot more investment than they are currently doing.
Thank you.
Commissioner Cleveland?
Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses. I was glad to hear all of you say that the meetings themselves, these mill meetings, may not be all that productive, because my experience of them is they are long lectures, and you leave wondering how that's improving relations. So I thought I might be the only one, but it sounds like you concur. So I think of these questions for Ms. Gunness and Mr. Saunders, but I'm happy to hear from anybody. I'm particularly interested in the PLO's relationship with Russia and Iran. Then I think, Ms. Gunness, you talked about exercises, maybe Mr. Saunders, this was you, that the South Koreans have set up military hotlines with air and naval capabilities with the Northern Command, and that the deputy commander of South Korea is present in Russian PRC exercises. And then, Ms. Gunness, you talk about PLA joint exercises with Russia and Iran. My first order question is, what are we learning about what's gained in these joint exercises, given your comments that, South Korea is an ally? What are we taking away from their participation in these exercises?
Let me give a preliminary answer, because this is an area we're researching right now. So to speak to the Iran piece, the PLA has been very careful in its relations with Iran. For a long time, they didn't do much military activity and they didn't exercise. The difference was the nuclear deal, and that, in their view, legitimized Iran as a legitimate partner to do things with, and from that point, economic and military engagement picked up. So that's a first point with Iran. The exercises don't seem that substantive. The exercises with Russia are much more substantive. And definitely it's a PLA goal to learn from the Russians, learn how they do things. It's also a goal to build interoperability between the two militaries. We're doing a research project right now that is coming up with metrics to look at each of those exercises. What's the military significance? What's the political signaling value? And to look for trends over time. And I think the preliminary thing we see is that there's an uptick in 2014, 2015, where it accelerates in terms of the sophistication, the scale of the exercises, the type of things they're doing with the Russians. A new thing over the last 3 years are various kinds of joint patrols, joint naval patrols, joint air patrols with bombers. So that's a new element that has just happened. Don't necessarily think there's all that much interoperability being built through those things, but the point is to signal a strategic willingness of the two countries and the two militaries to cooperate. And then the last point, so we're doing more work on that. At some future point, I hope to have more details on that. Then the final question you asked was about the ROC hotlines. This started out in the wake of a near miss when there was an incident when I believe a ROC airliner was almost shot down. And the ROC understandably was very upset about this. They wanted to have ways to talk to the PLA. Initially, it was with the Air Force and Navy headquarters. After the reform, that has moved to be the Northern Theater Command, Navy component headquarters, and the Air Force headquarters. But it is unclear to me how well those are used, how effective they are. We've pitched a project to our Korean counterparts to examine that issue. And there's a little reluctance to go there, unfortunately. But I think that's an interesting area. And in the broader recommendation that Kristen had and that I had as well, I think there's value in engaging our allies and partners about these kinds of things. And that's the kind of thing we can talk about. How's your hotline working? Do they pick up when you call? You know, what's the best practice here? And are you doing things that are working more effectively than us, or vice versa? You know, how do we best coordinate our approaches?
Ms. Gunness, if you could sort of build on that in the context of your testimony about the exercises that involve NATO and Europe and PLA, and I think you noted that it assisted the PLA in their operational learning. I'm curious what we learned. I'd like elaboration on what they learned, but what do you think we learned?
Yeah, so I mean, this was back when the PLA started its counter-piracy operations, so they actually did learn quite a bit from operating with the foreign navies at that time. I don't think that would necessarily be the case nowadays because they're just more practiced at it. In terms of what we learned, I mean, I think we did learn a bit in terms of how they do or do not do command and control.
That was where I was
that
going.
would be one of the major points that we learned, is that, you know, for at least when the counter-piracy operations first started, the commanders of these ships had to call back to Beijing to make any decision. That has since they're working on reforming that, but that kind of hierarchy with command and control and the you know, fostering the ability of commanders in the field to be able to make their own independent decisions is something that the PLA has written about extensively as being an issue and a challenge. And it's part of what the reform efforts have been aimed at fixing.
Okay. I think my time is up.
Great, thanks. Commissioner Borokoff.
Well, first, let me say thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to learn today the depth that you are going to follow this military diplomacy question. And the message that I got from all of this is clear that, like everything else in their country, there's a very vertical management scheme. So I'm curious, I just want to reiterate, I think, what you said, and then I think I have a question for Dr. Saunders and probably also for you, Mr. Link, and please jump in, Ms. Gunness. If I understand it correctly, the Office of the Central Military Commission has the Office of International Military Coordination directly under it. And then they report through the defense minister to Xi Jinping. So the fellow who was the ambassador from China, Xinzong, I hope I said that correctly, known as a wolf warrior, spent a lot of time bashing us last year and the year before. Also spent a tremendous amount of time in our country visiting with governors and mayors and localities and business leaders, becoming friends. And in a great sense, I'm learning that was a form of military diplomacy. And he's now been appointed the foreign affairs minister. And in Dr. Saunders, in your testimony, you mentioned that there's a seat on the Foreign Affairs Commission derived from the defense minister, which goes straight down the line. So I'm curious, first, do you see his appointment, which was only a few weeks ago, changing anything or enhancing anything that they're already doing? And then secondly, Mr. Link, I'm curious about the MSP, I apologize for that. Do they report up to the same structure, and do they eventually also have a seat at the Foreign Affairs Commission? Is there a central plan there? And do you see any change because of the change in the Foreign Affairs Commission? Ministry.
I'll be concise because I don't have a good answer for you. But what I would say is what matters is the party organ, the Central Foreign Affairs Commission. That's the decision makers. The foreign minister has a voice in that, is a member of that, participates in those discussions, and then he goes out to execute what the commission decides. So I think that's, it's an important position.
But it's not
the party position that is the one that makes the decisions and issues the guidance.
Good to know.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. It's a great question. I think that it reports more up through like the central legal apparatus rather than foreign affairs.
So you don't know of any specific coordination between the two different arms of this military diplomacy?
No.
Eventually, obviously, it all focuses on one man, but that's good to know that that they haven't coordinated. Go ahead, Ms. Gunness.
I was just going to say, I actually looked at this I just did a search of PLA writings to see if there was anything that specifically talked about the PLA coordinating with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and did not find much of anything. So I don't know, that's just an anecdote. But
Best news today. Thank you.
I'll just flag, the area that we don't know that much about, which is the National Security Commission, which is a new organ set up in 2014. It is supposed to play some kind of an information sharing, policy coordination role. We know it has civilians, we know it has foreign ministry people, we know it has military people, it likely, almost certainly has public security people on it. But it is a little bit of a black box trying to understand how much is it a policy-making organ, how much of it is a policy coordination organ, how much of it is an information-sharing organ. It seems to be at least partly a control mechanism. My colleague Joel Wuthnow looked into this and found that this is a structure that's replicated not just at the center, but down at the provinces and lower levels, with at least part of the goal of keeping everybody on the same page and following Xi Jinping's guidance on security. But that's an area where this kind of coordination might be taking place. But we don't know enough about what exactly it does. There's very little reporting on its activities.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, Bartholomew.
Thanks very much, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Again, it's our kickoff hearing, so this is a great way to frame a lot of the issues that we'll be thinking of moving forward. I'm going to start, Mr. Link. It's really, really difficult to hear about these exercises of the activities of the NPS without being outraged. And I want to just also really acknowledge the work of the NGOs, particularly Safeguard Defenders, for their recent expose, really, of what has been happening with these police stations. I just find myself wondering, in country after country, did the powers of the be not know what was going on? Did they see what was going on and ignore it? I mean, it's pretty alarming for people to hear that there are Chinese police stations functioning in cities across the United States, for example, and what they are doing in terms of outreach against dissidents or things like that. Do you think there was a willful blindness, or people just didn't see it?
Thank you for the question. So this is purely speculation on my part. Part of it could be a language barrier. A lot of the signs were, posted in Chinese, and, most people in America don't speak Chinese, so they wouldn't understand that it says, Chinese police station. So there's that. I also think that the jury's still a little bit out on, what the true purpose of these stations are. There are reports that I think it was, in a suburb of Paris that, someone, was operating from one of these stations and, harassed someone to return to China. Then there's also been work that kind of says that it's more of an administrative type deal to renew driver's license and things like that. I think that we just need more evidence still. And so, we recently saw the FBI raid in New York City looking through that. So I guess we're just going to have to wait until we can have the details from that investigation.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Following up on Commissioner Cleveland's question sort of about China, Russia, Iran, I also want to expand it to these exercises, China, Russia, South Africa exercises that are taking place. I mean, we know about this no limits partnership between China and Russia. I'm just wondering if it if in terms of the concept of military diplomacy, if there's coordination beyond the exercises in terms of where they might be focusing, what it is they're trying to achieve. Is there any evidence that there's any broader coordination? I am not at all minimizing the consequences and the significance of the exercises, but is there ongoing relationship building that is part of all of this military diplomacy, China, Russia, and everywhere else?
Well, I think it's a little bit of what I was saying in my testimony, that there's this broader objective of China cultivating relations with countries that it perceives may be willing to push back on the Western-led system. And so, in terms of the naval exercises in particular, I think to talk to Dr. Saunders' earlier point, a lot of that is political signaling. But the fact that, China and Russia are doing naval exercises, in the Indo-Pacific in various areas is a significant signal in terms of the signal about the partnership. So I do think there's sort of these broader objectives that China has in having these types of exercises. But maybe Dr. Saunders can talk more specifically.
Your microphone, yeah.
There's a broader relationship that includes things like military technology cooperation, which is both arms sales and technology development. The Russians are helping China as it starts to think about a missile warning system and how to integrate that into their nuclear forces and their nuclear situational awareness. The exercises, do now include combined arms. They include different layers of joint command and control. So there's a lot that's happening in those spaces, but a lot of it is political signaling. The message that they're trying to get across is that China and Russia can work together and can work together to thwart specific U.S. interests. And that's something the U.S. has to consider and be constrained by that. And that's sort of the challenge here, is there's still a lot of tensions, there's still a lot of suspicion. So sort of parsing how much of the military cooperation is real and what's its significance, how much of it is signaling and exaggerated, and we should, have an accurate understanding of what it really means. That's some of the work we're doing now to try to dig into those things in more detail and get a better understanding of both the military significance and the political value of it.
Can I follow up on that? Because unless we really look at sort of Russia's wholesale destruction of infrastructure and in Ukraine, I at least can't say that they've had a lot of military success per se. And I just keep wondering, is the PLA comfortable? I mean, with we keep talking about, well, they're learning this or they're cooperating on that, but, sort of lessons learned or even the technology. I just read this morning that there are tanks from Russian tanks from 1944 that are in Laos, that Laos is now sending back to Russia for use. I mean, educate me about what is it that they are actually learning from this cooperation. I understand the signaling, right? I understand the authoritarianism versus democracy and all of that, but just in terms of what are they actually getting out of this education-wise?
Speak to that, and I'll plug my colleague Joel Wuthnow, we recently published an article by him that goes into some detail. But I think they looked at the Russians as being an advanced military in terms of combined arms operations, command and control, how they use intelligence and get it out to the field. And so a military that was more advanced in a lot of these areas, both at a technical level, but also knowing how to put the pieces together to make it work. That was a partial model for the PLA reforms, going to a brigade structure. That was influenced by the U.S. military, influenced by the Russian military as well. So they sort of thought the Russians had figured a lot of this stuff out. They studied what they did and then adapted it to their purposes. With Ukraine, they are finding a lot of the weaknesses and problems in this model when you actually try to make it work. And you learn from that as well, what not to do. I think some of the lessons are that you can get really bogged down in an operation, and it's really hard to get momentum picked up again. And that may affect how the PLA thinks about an issue like Taiwan. Historically, they want to have very tight operations security and keep what they're going to do a surprise. But if you can't execute what you're going to do, you run into even bigger problems. So I suspect that's a lesson they've taken away is you've got to practice, you've got to know you can do what you plan to do. And maybe it's more important to practice it and be confident that you can execute it rather than so much keep it from, the eyes of U.S. intelligence or Taiwan intelligence. So they're learning a lot from the mistakes the Russians are making.
Yeah, I would just add to that a lot of the ground force exercises that were conducted before Ukraine was partly because the PLA wanted to hear about operational experience from Russians coming back from Syria, for example, and other operations where they had obviously more success. So I think that is that up until Ukraine, that was one of the reasons for the joint exercises in terms of what they would learn, because the PLA has not, the deployments they've made are very small so far. So,
Thank you.
Great. Well, I have a question for our PLA watchers and a question for our MPS watcher. The first question, and maybe Dr. Saunders first and Ms. Gunness, I think we can learn a lot about what the Chinese are up to if we understand organization and people involved. And just anecdotally, it seems to me a lot of their military diplomacy, particularly with the U.S., has been conducted by military intelligence professionals and political warfare professionals. In fact, even in some of our dialogue where we were hoping for operational cooperation, like safety on the high seas, we'd get the intel collectors and the political warfare specialists. So with the recent reorganization with the OIMC and maybe what you've observed of late, does that remain the case that this is very sort of intel heavy when they engage in military diplomacy?
It's a little hard to say because I haven't been to China in 3 years, and so my contact with them has been limited. Before, it was explicitly the purview of military intelligence and the military intelligence apparatus when OIMC's predecessor reported directly to the Joint Staff Department. Now it is a little more of its own thing, but there is a flow of people from the Joint Staff Department intelligence side who are coming into the OIMC right now. And there's a little bit of a struggle, I think, between Ministry of Defense that has formal control, the Joint Staff Department, which lost control and would like to have some of its own people there watching it. So I think some of that is coming back, and then some of those people were intelligence people before, and they're still intelligence people today. But I will note, I'm going to make a quick plug for U.S.-China mill-to-mill. One of the interesting things we did is we hosted PLA students. And these were not all intel people or foreign affairs specialists. These were their corps commanders. These were their senior colonels who were in operational units. And that was one of the few contacts we ever get with the operational side of the PLA. And we were careful what we talked to them about, but we learned a lot from a little bit of exposure to the people. And those really are the future leaders of the PLA. The intel guys are not going to be running the military. So I'd just note that that's one side benefit of mill-to-mill is we got to interact with the operational people and take their temperature a little bit, which was a useful thing to do.
yeah, I think you'll always have a certain element of intel professionals and political warfare, certainly, in any interaction. But I think in terms of China's expansion of non-traditional security operations and its ability to deploy more often with more capability overseas, I think we'll probably find hopefully more robust interactions with some of the operators rather than just having it be a political endeavor.
Thank you. I think it is an important thing to continue to watch. I mean, who shows up will tell us a lot about what they're up to and what they're doing. Mr. Link, part of our mission, actually our core mission, is to advise Congress. You described some things that are pretty outrageous in terms of Chinese activities on our soil. I don't have the legal background to say what the tools are to deal with that, but it would seem to me, it would be entirely appropriate to sanction the organization, sanction individual. I don't even know, but what I would like is your assessment. Are there appropriate tools for dealing with this this emerging problem? And if not, what kind of authorities should the administration be seeking from the Congress?
Thank you. No, that's a great question. There's a lot more detail on that in my report, but just off the top of my head, we need to assess all the different gaps that are, within our legal system that, that the MPS is able to abuse. Currently, like transnational repression as like a term, as like a vocab word, is not really, outlawed anywhere in our, legal system. So there's that. When people bring these cases, or when our legal system bring these cases to court and things of that nature, we're relying on very like outdated laws that haven't like accounted for the advent of like the internet and internet stalking and things of that nature. So just kind of, getting all of the different parts of the U.S. government that, have to deal with this issue, whether it's the FBI or DOJ or DHS and all that, like someone needs to like lead kind of like a working group to assess what are all of the different issues that we have when we are bringing these cases to court, and then from there, how do we better shape or better write legislation that's very specific, that makes it much more easier for these cases to be brought to court.
Thank you. We do have time for a second round.
No.
And for those on screen, I see Aaron's hand up.
I have a question.
And Jim can certainly go. Okay. Well, let's go with this order then, which would be Jim, Aaron, and Robin.
If there's time.
Commissioner Mann.
Thanks. I have a question for Jordan Link. Help me out with the history and background of the MPS's overseas role. When I lived and covered China many decades ago, there was a simple rule of thumb that the MSS operated overseas and the MPS was the public security, what was the domestic public security agency. So when did the MPS start operating overseas, and when is this something of the last few years, or has this been going on without us knowing it for a long time?
Thank you for the question. I would say generally the trend has, the MPS activity has increased significantly under President Xi Jinping. We could probably pinpoint 2017 as the most consequential year. There was, during that year, President Xi Jinping gave a keynote speech at the General Assembly of Interpol where he referred to like the global security governance system, which is how all these different security institutions globally interact with each other. And he was very clear with his displeasure with the current system, calling for it to be reformed and altered and things of that nature. And then also that same year, there was an internal meeting of top public security officials where they were pretty much given the marching orders to grasp the new characteristics of public security cooperation abroad and be more active abroad and things like that. So, the database that I've built, pretty much, shows that, kind of 2017 is one of the key years. I guess I would also point to 2014 as another important year, because that's when Operation Fox Hunt was, formally initiated. However, I think the first data point in my database goes back to 1995. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's other things that I've missed, obviously, so probably even before that. But
can I ask what happened in 1995?
That's a good question. I would have to look at it. It's either a bilateral meeting or a formal agreement that was signed with some foreign country. I can get back to you, though.
Okay, and just one other question. You spoke of their overseas, their liaison with foreign governments. Does the Justice Department, at least as far as I know, the criminal division had regular visits to and discussions with the Chinese government. Is that still going on?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Commissioner Friedberg?
Yes, I also had a question for Mr. Link. would it be fair to say that what China is currently doing or has begun to do is to export its model and its techniques for what they refer to as stability maintenance to like-minded countries?
I think that it's definitely a push and a pull factor. There's, several high-level quotes from Chinese officials about, wanting to, be more active abroad in police training and training police with Chinese characteristics and things of that nature. But at the same time, other governments, other countries have to, accept this training and want this training. So it's kind of it's both export and import.
Okay. You refer at several points to China's dissatisfaction. You say Beijing's discontent with the current liberal democratic order. And later you say that they're trying to put forward an alternative global governance vision. Could you say more about what you think it is that they have in mind? And in particular, do they really believe that they can transform these global norms as they exist now, or erode the prevailing norms to the extent that they're a reflection of liberal democratic concepts? Are they trying to erode that globally, or are they trying to carve out a kind of partial subsystem of the larger international system that will be made up of states that accept their views in particular about stability maintenance?
Mm-hmm. I think it's more about trying to create an international, system that is, more amenable and more safer for the CCP to exist within. And so that's why we see things, like the comprehensive national security concept kind of, being pushed abroad through the Global Security Initiative. It's kind of like the foreign policy, extension of, this own domestic understanding of, political security and things like that. So I think it really just comes back to it's like a part of a strategy to maintain political power at all costs.
Okay, thank you very much.
Commissioner Cleveland.
Thank you. I'm interested in, we've talked about prestige and carving out, as Dr. Friedberg just noted, carving out a space for the CCP to strengthen its position. But I'm curious how economic interests tie into all of this. And Commissioner Bartholomew mentioned the exercises with South Africa, which I see is very much related to mineral interests. I wonder if you could identify partnerships or exercises where there are no economic interests, whether it's ports, minerals, or energy, because it seems to me much of the military diplomacy is fused with or twinned with these economic objectives. And we haven't talked about that yet. And the follow-on question is, if China's economy doesn't recover, what does it mean for how expansive these undertakings might continue to be? Phil, because you sort of wobbled, I'm going to go to you first.
Never show weakness. No, we've tried to do some of this work, and we're doing some more of it to look at whether partnerships or economic interests, kind of the influence they have over military diplomacy or high-level visits. And it's been something of a struggle to find quantitative correlations between that. You think if a country has oil or has resources, that Chinese leaders would be more likely to go there, or they'd be more likely to do military exercises. But it's hard to find those patterns when we do quantitative data to dig into it. I think there's a broader sense of strategic significance, which does encompass economic interests, which does encompass strategic location along China's sea lines of communications, and some of that is kind of baked in. But there's sort of a countervailing bureaucratic tendency. So let's say you're the Europe officer for the Office of International Military Cooperation. I've got all these Eurasian countries, and maybe I'm going to focus my attentions on the ones that are more powerful, more important, more strategic, but I want to do something with everybody. So I think there are things where that happen just to sort of fill out the dance card, as it were. that don't necessarily have a lot of economic significance or strategic significance. And that may be why when we do these quantitative approaches trying to get at it, we struggle to find statistically significant relationships, because some of it is just that bureaucratic incentive. I got to do something with everybody in my portfolio, and the significance sort of washes out.
Have you done any analysis, and Ms. Gunness, I'm interested in your answer, done any analysis that identifies the critical inputs that China has identified they need for indigenous innovation and manufacturing, like lithium or cobalt or oil, and then charted, mapped those critical inputs with the development of ports and mill-to-mill, these military relationships? Because I think, for me, anecdotally, it's evident whether you look at Sudan, South Africa, Turkey, there's Kazakhstan, there is a pattern to building out the military because there is an economic interest at stake. Afghanistan, for example, recently.
Yes, and that is, but again, in the quantitative studies, it doesn't really come through. Where it comes through, for example, is UN peacekeeping, where China is participating in the Sudan and South Sudan missions, and they tried to govern the South Sudan one in ways that it would protect Chinese oil investments there, and the UN pushed back and didn't let them do what they want. So I think you're right.
Eventually, they push back.
Yes, yes. So I think you're right that these are drivers. But my point is just when you try to, they're not that tractable to statistical analysis when we try to do that.
In the strict context of mill-to-mill. So that's what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, Ms. Gunness? Mr. Lincoln?
Yeah, I would just add to that, I mean, most of what I've looked at has been China's approach to military relations with countries in the Belt and Road, which obviously the economic interests precede that, right? But I will say there are different reasons why they have security presence in different countries. You mentioned Afghanistan, but Tajikistan is another one where I don't think there's a ton of economic interest, but there is a lot of interest in stability, maintaining stability in Central Asia, and also building relations with those countries. And so, I think one of the reasons it is hard to quantify these types of engagements in that way is that they sort of nest within each other. And so, anyway, it's this difficult question.
Yes, sort of a variation on what Commissioner Cleveland just asked. When we had our hearing on China in Latin America, people really emphasized this whole of government approach that the CCP uses. And so I find myself wondering, that they'll tap into something when they want to close a deal. Are there examples where part of what they're doing is saying, okay, we'll give you military training or we'll do some sort of military engagement, and that's what's being used to accomplish something else? Might be economic, but they can tap into all of these different resources. And I'm presuming that military engagement or military training exercises something like that as one of the tools that they can use. But are there examples where that's happening? I guess, Phil, it's the same problem, right? Which is, how do you quantify something like that?
I think what we see is if let's say they're doing a strategic partnership with something. In the process of negotiating, you think about all the things you can do. You're going to have this partnership agreement. You're going to have a joint statement saying all the great things we're going to do. And the military security cooperation, military diplomacy is one of those lines of effort. And in supporting overall Chinese diplomacy, I'm sure the OIMC says, yes, this country is a priority for China, and what can we do in our lane to support that? But I'm pressed to find, sort of specific quid pro quos. We will, there are things you can point to where they agree to take more students in Chinese military academies or do specific things like that. But it doesn't seem to be a big enough payoff, to make the whole thing go. It seems to be a little piece of a broader line of effort to improve the relationship with the country. Not usually that I can think of the critical one that turns a no into a yes. It's more like it's part of the package. Yeah, it's part of the package, and they want something to be in that space, but it doesn't seem to be the critical part of the package.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example of this is China's approach to relations with African countries. And I think that's where, you see that, where it's sort of this building block approach of, economic interests, foreign policy interests, and then the security, now they're bolstering security cooperation with a number of African nations. So but again, it is sort of something that isn't purely military to get other access. It's all nested within each other.
Thank you.
Commissioner Wessel?
Thank you all. I want to ask, and maybe Mr. Link, I'll let you ask you to start, but there's been a lot of discussion lately for several years now about technology, surveillance, etc., as both an enabling and disabling technology. Can you help me as it relates to overseas surveillance, et cetera, how that might be integrated into the strategies we're talking about here?
I guess that I would speak to that mostly from the, capacity building perspective, that there have been, times that the MPS has trained other countries in surveillance techniques. So I guess it's, again, it gets to that export or import issue. It's clear that the MPS is willing to offer up these abilities, and it's also clear that other countries, want them. So it's a.
But is it also a projection opportunity? Is it, there's been a lot of concern about not only, of course, enabling, let's say, a Mideast country to do surveillance, but is there sharing of that surveillance data or illicit access to it that's been discussed that might be enabling Chinese capabilities?
I don't know.
Okay. Any of the other witnesses?
I've done a little research on the export of Chinese surveillance technology, and I would just say that China, along with the sort of quote unquote stability operations whatever, I can't remember the term.
Stability maintenance.
Thank you, stability maintenance. That the Chinese are providing the leaders of certain governments with the ability to then broadly surveil their populations, and that feeds into the narrative and also into the actual practice of it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Wong?
Sorry, I thought there was someone ahead of me. Mr. Link, thanks for your testimony. I want to press you a little bit on your recommendation that there are gaps here legally, and maybe I should read more closely some of the papers of the colleagues that you cite. But just thinking about this, I kind of see here that a not even that creative prosecutor can find ways to get at this, whether it's violation of terms of visas for these MPS officers who are here, to the extent they're doing you can twist it into propaganda work. There's FARA violations at a municipal or state level. I mean, if they're extorting people for threats to their family, if it's surveillance data breaches. I mean, there are laws in the books. It seems to me that if a prosecutor wanted to go after this, they could. But put that aside, well, that's the first question, whether there truly are legal gaps. The second question is, should this really be a legal matter? Or is this, should we treat this, the better way to get at this in a more clean fashion is treat it as a CI and intelligence matter, and we deal with intelligence operations in the US that we don't like by expelling, PNGing, other methods that we use, and elevating it to be a political matter, that we have to bring this up in political dialogue at multiple levels, even up to the highest level, rather than try to pick at this, minutely through law enforcement. So I guess are there really legal gaps? That's question number one. And number two, is that really the best way to get at this? Should it be more CI and political?
Gotcha.
Can I just add to that? I think that's really important, that the way we treated the Soviets in terms of where they were allowed to travel, how close they could get to military bases, but emphasizing your CI approach,
Thank you for the questions. I'll start with the second one first, where it seems like we need a more holistic approach and kind of doing both concurrently at the same time, given the number of cases of Operation Foxhunt that we've seen in the U.S. I think that would make sense. In terms of the legal gaps, from my research process, speaking to some of the folk that are involved in actually charging these people and things like that. They were the ones that told me that there are legal gaps. And I think, a lot of other research indicates like the issues behind not having transnational repression be like outlawed as like a, like a term of art or whatever, that would probably just help a lot in these situations.
Thank you. I think we have 3 minutes. I have a question, but I don't think it would lend itself to quick answers. So maybe if you'd be willing, I can follow up for the record. So with that, we'll close our first panel. Thank you very much again to our witnesses.
We'll be back at 11:20.
And we will be back at 11:20.